Hi, welcome to episode 6 in our series on the anatomy of a digitally transformed organization, this one on the service provider layer. As I always say, if you haven't watched it already, please watch episode 1, the overview, before you watch this detailed one. It'll put a bit more context to it. Okay, so what we're talking about here is a horizontally layered architecture, the critical layering for a digitally transformed organization as opposed to a vertically layered architecture. And in this particular episode, we're talking about this bottom layer here, the service provider layer within the architecture. So the service provider layer, the simple one line, is the thing that provides or exposes the services to the integration layer so they can be wrapped as APIs ready for consumption by our process layer or our channel layer. So it exposes the business logic from the solutions, both internal and external solutions, to the integration layer to be wrapped or exposed as processes or APIs. So that's the board function of the layer. Let's talk about some of the critical success factors, and there'll be some overlap with this one on the integration layer because they're so tightly related. I'm going to spend the rest of this video going into a lot of detail on the final point here. But broadly, this layer exposes the business service, the integration layer. It contains all the non-process flow business logic, things like, you must be a pensioner to apply for this type of mortgage, or you must have had this sort of criteria to apply for a particular grant. All the business rules that aren't about the process flow itself. There must be true business services, as in something that a business would recognize as a service, update customer details, track my shipping details, check credit rating. True business service, not a technical service like update SAP Indicator 7, which is clearly a technical service. They must be atomic, as I said in the prior one, stateless, and leave the business in a consistent state. They're always called via the integration layer. They cannot be called directly. Technically they can, but in the architecture to be agile and adaptive, they must go via the integration layer, or they could potentially bypass the monitoring and logging and security that's enforced by that layer. They can be provided by in-premise solutions, cloud solutions, outsourced service providers, external service providers, anyone that basically provides a service that you want to incorporate into your organization's ecosystem. But finally, and the most difficult part to get right in this layer is the billion-dollar question, as it's jokingly referred to on the internet for digital transformation, is what is the right granularity for my services? As I said in the overview, we kind of instinctively know that apply for a mortgage isn't a service, it's an entire process. And on the flip side, update customer first name, update customer second name is too low a granularity for a service, doesn't leave the business in a consistent state, and certainly isn't going to give you a reusable service. But how you get the granularity of these services right is a really difficult question, and I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation exploring that in just a little bit of detail. So one of the critical things you're going to need for this is a concept called a business capability model. There are a number of videos on our channel about this in more detail, but in a simple one-line definition, a capability model is a model of what your organization does, not how it does it, which is a process model, or who does it, which is an organizational structure model, but what you do is covered in a capability model. On this diagram, you see a pretty typical capability model, largely just a set of boxes, but structure is everything, and there is a bit of logic, and in particular, Fragile to Agile bring a concept called data affinity analysis to the defining of these capability models. And I mention that because without bringing that to the table, you won't be able to draw these service containers. But the first step to solving the service granularity problem is to define these service containers. They're identified as those red boxes on this diagram. Talk a little bit about how you define them in a second, but broadly, once you have the service granularity problem, is turned from some sort of obscure art form into a simple engineering exercise. I decompose my process until an individual process step's needs in terms of skills, data, etc., can all be met inside a service container, so everything is encapsulated inside one of those red boxes. Stop. I've now finished process design and I'm ready for service design. That, in other words, that's the right granularity for me to expose my service. That's a pretty hard rule once you define these service containers, but how do you define them? Well, look, there are about 5 or 6 business inputs and about 10 technical inputs. I'm just going to give you one here to give you a bit of exposure. A, to keep the video short, and B, because frankly this is a core part of Fragile to Agile's intellectual property and I'm not going to give away the kitchen sink. But let's look at one core input, is what we call operating model standardization. In other words, can a capability be standardized across the whole organization, or do different business units need a different instance or different solution for that capability? So within financial services is a core capability called credit risk decisioning. Are they going to give Glenn Smyth a loan effectively? And we look at two sub-capabilities within that, customer risk scoring and transaction risk scoring. So customer risk scoring is what is Glenn Smyth or any person's capacity to repay $100,000. Well, my capacity to repay $100,000 is completely independent of the product for which I apply. In other words, it doesn't matter if I'm applying for a home loan or I'm applying for a boat loan or margin lending, my capacity to repay is my capacity to repay. And so for customer risk scoring is inherently standardizable across the whole organization. Transaction risk scoring is, am I asking for a loan for a $100,000 apartment in a, that's worth $3 million in New York? Or am I asking for a loan for a $500,000 house in a poor area of Los Angeles that's only worth $600,000, just for way of example. So that's transaction risk in a mortgage. In margin lending, am I asking for a loan to buy some shares in BHP Billiton or Citibank or a large blue chip, or am I asking to take a loan in Dodgy Miner Inc. And shares in that? So that's transaction risk for a margin lending. Now, transaction risk is fundamentally non-standardizable or non-shareable across financial services. It's reusable within an individual business line, but it's not across the whole organization. So to recap, customer risk scoring is fundamentally standardizable across the whole of a financial services organization. Transaction risk scoring is not. So one of the golden rules for a service container is a service container cannot contain a mixture of standardized and non-standardized service capabilities. So consequently, we cannot draw the service boundary or service container boundary at the credit risk decisioning level here. We have to go one further below and draw it around customer risk scoring and transaction risk scoring. That will mean that we'll have separate services for transaction risk scoring and customer risk scoring, and we won't have a single service that does all the credit risk decisioning. We have proven through numerous transformations in a bank that when done the former way with separate services, not only do you get a very, very large scale reuse of the customer risk scoring service, but also actually within a business unit, the margin lending service, transaction risk scoring service gets reused across a number of margin lending services within margin lending. And, the mortgage one gets reused across a number of different mortgage lines. So you actually also get reuse at the transaction risk scoring service within the business unit to which they are unique. So this really does take the promise of this service architecture and digital transformation and make it real and genuinely give you the sort of reuse that's required from these services to pay back your investment in this technology, but most importantly, to give you the agility and adaptability you need to thrive in the digital age. Thank you.